So, once again, thank you for joining us today for the current issues dialogue. I know that there are a ton of other things that you could be doing today, but you decided to join us. So, we thank you from the Office of Multicultural Engagement. My name is Monique Gore. I am the Director for Programming and Outreach for the office. And I am also a Gettysburg College class of 2006 alum. I want to ensure that we are maximizing our time because there is a lot for us to cover as there's a lot going on in society right now. So because you registered, I sent out the format and I want to keep to that agenda as much as possible given the amount of time that we have today. So I am going to allow our speakers to introduce themselves. And then when we get to the question portion, I'd like for everyone to stay muted, but you can put your question in the chat. We will be monitoring the chat and asking the panelists questions via the chat. So I think that is it. So let's get started. First up is Professor Williams. He is the director of the Peace and Justice program here at Gettysburg College. He teaches in the education department, Africana Studies department, and probably something else, but I will allow him to continue on with his introduction. Professor Williams?
You so much, Monique. And just to clarify, are we each just introducing ourselves right now, and then we will dive into more of the program?
You're introducing yourself and then you dive in. So everyone will introduce themselves prior to speaking.
Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this today. And thank you for all those who are making the time to listen in and to learn more and to ask some critical questions. My name is Hakim Williams. I'm Associate Professor of Africana Studies. I direct the college's Peace and Justice Studies program, and I'm an affiliate of Education, Public Policy, and Globalization Studies. So I want to spend a little bit of time, and I think my time is somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes. I want to make sure and keep track of that because I really want to hear questions from the students. So first I want to say regarding protests, I have been involved in a number of protests, largely in New York City, where I lived for 14 years. I'm currently in Carlisle. I go back and forth between Carlisle and Gettysburg, and so I have not had the privilege to be part of the New York City protests, and I feel very sad about that. But I'm definitely finding ways to support organizers, strategists, and folks who are out in the streets there. With that being said, my field of peace and justice studies it's varied, and I care deeply about multiple causes and issues. One, of course, is Black Lives Matter. And I have been part of a number of protests involving that, as well as strategy sessions. I'm also interested in intersectional causes, where Black folks are interested in the causes that affect other communities. For example, I'm part of Blacks for Palestine, and other such issues. And so I believe it's also important to, in this moment, to remind communities that there are other communities supporting Black folks now, and that's not new, right? Another point I want to raise is the value of historicizing what's happening today. I'm not a historian, so I'm going to leave that to Professor Scott Hancock to talk more about that. But in many of my classes, whenever I talk about contemporary issues around social injustice, I always try to historicize them, that these issues did not crop up overnight, that they have a long legacy, a deep history behind them. And I just shared an article yesterday on Facebook. It was about the history of the Fed Up Rising, and it started in 1619, right? So I've been seeing on my Facebook, and I have varied opinions and friends of different persuasions on my Facebook, and so I see I see the breadth of the discourse on there. And there's lots of fear and confusion and anxieties around the protests that are happening right now. And folks are asking, why are folks looting? Why are folks burning stuff down? And I shared that article because it showed that um, various uprisings here in the United States, when they occur on this level, that they have lots of precedent behind them, that folks are suffering in their communities, and the suffering, there's lots of silences around that suffering. And so I ask folks before they critique what they perceive to be different kinds of protestations happening right now, to ask ourselves, what has led to this moment? What have people been enduring in their communities that we have been blind to? And many folks have been blind to it. And so linked to that, I also want to say, apart from educating oneself on what's happening in this particular moment, asking yourself, what can I do? Because I don't think everyone needs to be out in the streets. So for example, with a pandemic raging right now, I personally am not going to go out into the streets. I applaud those who are out in the streets, but I think there's a role for everyone. I saw two former students from Gettysburg College just last night who pledged to match $1,000 that they would give to the NAACP legal fund. In a matter of hours, they raise $1,000, and therefore they're going to match that thousand. That'd be $2,000 that they'll be giving to the end of. And one is a white student and one student is of Armenian background. And I was so proud to see Gettysburg College students. And I know that there are others who are taking these kinds of initiatives. So that's one thing that you can do. You can fundraise for several organizations. One is blacklivesmatter.org, who are doing wonderful work and have been doing wonderful work in communities, right? Another thing you can do, if you have a friend who is a protester out there, you can serve as their emergency contact. So you can help them create a plan. If they are arrested, if they get wounded, you can be that emergency contact for them. You can cook pre or post protest. People need to be fed, right? So that is one thing that you can do. You can also volunteer. So there are a number of organizations doing wonderful work out there. If you have skills in IT, you can help them create a database. You can maintain that database. Or you can volunteer in other ways. You can help host or create strategy sessions. If you are an artist, art plays a wonderful, important role in protests. Sometimes you see a sign at a protest, and it encapsulates all that you want to say in a million words, and that sign encapsulates that. So there is a place for artists in this movement. You can offer childcare. If there are friends who want to go to the protest, but they have children, you could offer to watch their kids while they're out there. These are just a few tidbits when folks ask, how can I play a role without having to be out in the streets? And you could email me. I have a whole running list, 50-something odd things like this that you can do. I also have a list of anti-racism resources that you can share with your families and your friends. If you have young kids, I also have books that you can read to your kids. People often say, I think my kid is too young to expose them to this. I don't think you should be showing your kids videos of people being killed in the streets. But there are books, age-appropriate books, that you can read to your children to raise their consciousness around some of these issues. So my email at the college is hwilliam, no S at the end, at gettysburgcollege.edu, and I can share with you any number of resources. I have tons of them. I just want to say that there is a role for everyone in this moment. And so don't shy away from asking for more resources. And I'll leave it at that. And I can expound on any of these during the Q&A. Again, thank you for this time.
Thank you, Professor Williams. And just a note, anything that is shared, links, we will be sharing post the event and sending out a resources list. And Professor Williams' email will be included in that. And you can contact him directly to get some of the resources that he just spoke about. So next we're going to have Professor Daly. I will mute and allow her to have the floor.
Hi, thanks everyone. I'm Amy Daly. I'm a professor in the Health Sciences Department. I'm an epidemiologist and I study social inequalities in health. And so an area of interest of mine is racism in health, and we're seeing this play out in many ways right now on the national stage. So we're seeing disparities in COVID-19 and then also police violence. And so I think these are two examples of public health crises where the root cause really is racism. And so racism is what I would say is the public health crisis here. And it's not new. We're seeing a lot of headlines right now about African Americans and Latinos and other populations of color taking the disproportionate burden of COVID, whether it's with new cases or higher mortality rates. And so there's a wide audience right now in ways that we haven't had this amount of attention on racial and ethnic disparities. And so I think people are starting to ask questions in ways they haven't asked questions before. And so I think this is an opportunity to be able to really talk about what are the underlying reasons for these disparities. People seem a little perplexed as to why are we seeing more deaths in these populations and more cases. And so I think people hopefully are genuinely interested in the reasons behind that. And I will say, there tends to be an automatic wanting to look for genetic or biological susceptibility. And I would say if you hear that narrative, that's a red flag for trying to not look at some of these other social inequalities that are really the root causes of these problems. And these are disparities that are rooted way before pandemic times. I would say that it's a result of systemic racism that plays out in a number of ways. So, of course, economic disparities. We're seeing populations disproportionately in higher risk public-facing jobs, lower income jobs. People who have lower incomes need to actually go out and work more. We've seen healthcare access differences. So, for example, in New Orleans, they realized that the testing sites weren't accessible to people without transportation. So realizing some basic disparities right there. I think a large part of the underlying disparities really come from chronic disease comorbidities, making populations at higher risk. And there's multiple ways that racism actually plays out with these chronic disease disparities. So obviously things like access to resources and healthcare and food and safe spaces, all of that's important. Increases in exposure, including air pollution. But what I want to point out here is that there are also direct results of racism that cannot be explained by socioeconomic status. I think this is another way that we ignore the direct effects of racism and saying, well, it all plays out in terms of socioeconomic differences. There's a lot of research now that shows that increased stress and constant vigilance has direct effects on bodies, and that's important as we think about some of these underlying conditions that make people more susceptible to this disease. And finally, I just wanted to mention, as we're talking about Black Lives Matter, they also need to be counted. And we're seeing vast undercounts of this disease, especially in terms of new cases. The way we collect data is problematic. Our mortality data is a little bit better by race and ethnicity, but about only 50% of the cases that are being reported actually have race and ethnicity collected along with that data. And so most people think that we're vastly undercounting the number of cases and particular populations. So I'll stop talking now in terms of some of these underlying causes of the COVID-19, but I want to reiterate that I don't think that the police violence and what we're seeing play out with COVID-19 are separate issues at all, and they're very connected to these underlying social inequalities and racism. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Williams and Professor Daly. We're going to take some time now to allow for questions in the chat. So if anyone has a question for Professor Daly or Professor Williams, please feel free to put it in the chat, and we'll go from there. And I'm sure the chat function works. So if we have no questions at this point, we can move forward and save all of our questions. Oh, we have one from Perry. What actions can the college take to materially help Black Lives Matters protesters? Professor Williams, Professor Daly?
It is a credo in the Black Lives Matter movement that they should put forth their requests versus other entities trying to come up with what they think protesters need. And so there needs to be more listening. So I would ask if there are BLM, Gettysburg College student protesters, if they have very specific demands, they should put forth those, and the college should respond to that. Because sometimes it is a case where entities think they know what's best, and they put initiatives or they have particular responses that are not in sync with what people need. Actually, on the BLM website, there is a particular list of demands. They're not unique or catered to higher education institutions. But if there are BLM students at Gettysburg College, you can either send them to me or the AFS faculty. And I know that we'll be more than willing to stand in solidarity with you in putting forth these requests to the college. I see also that Susan Russell is writing, speaking of counting. Okay, so this is for Amy Daly. Okay. Hopefully that answers your question, Perry.
Susan Russell writes, speaking of counting, could you please speak about the importance of the census? Thanks so much for this panel.
I think Susan brings up an excellent point here in terms of counting people in general, especially for public health data, but also resources in terms of government resources. We know that populations of color are undercounted, especially as we think about immigrant populations in Adams County in particular, and making sure that they're in our denominators and so that we're able to have accurate counts. So I don't know if anybody else wants to add to that.
So the next question is, my family has been trying to be positive and active during this time, but we have not had an actual genuine conversation at this point. Is it right for us to have a conversation between ourselves on this topic, or is there something better we could do, such as listen to a talk or speech or anything? I don't know who wants to take that.
Yeah, Timothy, thank you for that question. I don't know what is your race or ethnicity, but if your background is if you're a white person, if your family is white, I would say yes, definitely need to have these conversations. I tell my students in my classroom, I can't have the conversation with your grandmother or your mom. I think it's more useful. You're in the classes, you're learning, you have the tools and you have the access to your family members. You definitely have to have those conversations. They're really important. And I think you can do both. You can have the conversations and continue learning more about what's happening. As I said, I have a list of resources I can send. I can send those to you if you're interested. And Monique said that we would post them. And there is another article I have. It lists 75 things that white persons can do right now to help the cause. My partner, who is white, he called up the police department here in Carlisle and asked what exactly is the training around anti-bias training for police officers? What is the training around de-escalation? And they responded to him and they said that he's welcome to join. They're having some sort of a call that's open to the community, and I believe he might try to attend that. So there are many things that white persons can do and must do because there is a role for allies. And so I hope that answered your question, Timothy.
Brittany Branch, for you, Professor Williams, how long would it take for the college to meet those demands once they are created? Would those needs be a priority?
I'm not in the college administration, so I cannot speak for the college admin. I would assume it depends on what those demands are. In my 8 years at Gettysburg College, there have been times when students have put forth certain demands, and some demands, they are low-hanging fruit, and the college has been able to respond to those rather quickly and put things in place. And then there are other demands that are sometimes not that feasible, that will require certain finances that the college cannot commit to at that point in time. And sometimes there are other demands that take more effort. It takes more coordination. And I think sometimes there is concern among students that the college administration moves too slowly sometimes. And sometimes I agree. Sometimes there have been times when I think, okay, no, this is a demand that you can move much faster on. And so I say, I don't want to answer in a vacuum right now. I would say it depends on the particular demands that any particular BLM students would put forth to the college.
Thank you. And again, just to reiterate, our resource sharing will go out to all those that registered for this event, and we'll be able to post it somewhere online as well, along with this recording. So we will continue with questions. All right, so next. Okay, what is the role for social media in this movement, in the role of performative activism?
Thank you for that. Someone asked a question, I think, before that, and the chat is moving rather quickly, so I may not be keeping up properly. I thought I saw another question before that one about.
Yes, Sarah sent the question. Professor Williams, I'm really interested in the role of nonviolence, and there are so many conflicting messages right now about what the right way to protest is. Can you speak a little about the role of nonviolence in social justice movements when there are so many complex reasons people choose to protest how they do? Thank you.
Sure. So my training is in the realm of Gandhian nonviolence. I try to practice that as much as I can. And when I say try to, as in I'm human and I will fail. So I want to start with that. So my approach to protest definitely emanates from the non-violent tradition. However, I don't think that there is any right way to protest. just like I believe that there are many ways of intervening for social change, right? And so I saw a meme recently, which links to the social media question here. I saw, the first part of the meme said, can you not, so they were showing, flames, buildings aflame, and people looting. And the question was, is there another way to protest? And then below that, they had Colin Kaepernick kneeling. And then the caption said, no, not that way. And then you had a Black celebrity at some award show using her platform to speak about Black Lives Matter. The caption said, no, not that way. And so the Black community is confused. You don't want folks to burn buildings down, but then you don't want Colin Kaepernick to be kneeling. You don't want high school athletes to be kneeling. You don't want folks to be ripping down Confederate monuments, So it sends a mixed message, right? And I think in the end, the hidden message in there is that we actually don't want any kind of protest, right? And that is problematic. So I am never one to tell people how to protest. I share how I am protesting, and I ask other folks, find your own way to protest and to speak up and to help make some kind of social change. And I believe in the end, it will come out to however it's going to come out. But I don't believe that there's any one way to protest. The other question in terms of what is the role of social media in this moment and the role of performative activism. I cannot know what exactly is in people's hearts unless they are honest about it. I am sure that there are people who will share a meme and they will think that they are being sufficiently woke, so to speak, that they have done their task. I can also say that sometimes a meme can open a conversation. I've seen so many conversations on Facebook under a particular meme, and it opens the door for people to share resources within that further conversation. And so I do think that there's a vital role for social media, but it doesn't end there, right? And so I don't think it's, do I do social media or am I out in the streets? I think you can do all of it, because I do that. I'm very active on social media. When I'm in New York City, I'm often out in the streets being part of protests. I believe that being an educator in my classroom, sharing critical readings plays a role as well too. Being on this panel today, that plays a vital role. So I think there are many different kinds of entry points. And so when it comes to questioning performative activism, I think, yes, it needs to be interrogated and critiqued. When it comes to individual persons, I don't know their hearts, I don't know their intentions, so therefore I don't come at them. I don't try to cancel them and say, is that all you're doing? Because maybe that's all, that is that person's capacity. And that's not my place to really question what is that person's capacity. I challenge all of us to do more. And to me, that's where it ends.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question before Professor Hancock begins. So, Amanda?
Okay, this question comes from BJ. He says, from the men's basketball program, is there any type of discussion around programming this upcoming school year to help facilitate conversations around race? We asked because as a student athletes and freshmen, we had to go through an alcohol and drug policy training and sexual violence. And I want to say there was more to it. And he continued saying, oh, hold on. Now since education is one of the reasons why we experience racial oppression, it would be great if any type of programming would be available for our students, the men's basketball team.
I believe I saw Jean Arnold on the call. And if you have just a moment to share about the healing racism, that would be perfect for this moment.
Sure. We were about to have our third annual Institute for Healing Racism, in May, but of course we had to cancel it when we all left campus in March. But this is a very intensive 2-day workshop that really digs deep into the history of racism in this country, We have excellent facilitators who really get you to connect with that intellectually and on a feelings level, to think about how racism has impacted your life, whether you're white or person of color, and really ends up with talking about those next steps of what should you do now that you're a little bit more informed and enlightened about the issues. And so we will bring it back in the fall. I'm going to try to get it back in the fall. And the long range goal for the college is really to train some trainers, to do a train the trainers, so that we would have facilitators within our own college who could do this on a more regular basis, because the workshops have to be small, 30 people or less, because of the intensity of them. And it takes 2 facilitators. So if we can evolve to the point where we have our own facilitators, we could do it more often. But it's going to take some flexibility on the part of students and faculty with schedules, because it is 2 full days. There are times when we can break it up if we had our own trainers to do, for instance, 4 consecutive, half days or something like that. But the best impact to really understand the content on an intellectual level, on a feelings level, is to spend 2 8-hour days in this workshop. So I encourage all of you, when we're able to bring it back, to try to make time for that. We've had the 2 cohorts who have gone through it already meet regularly to talk about how can they apply their knowledge to Gettysburg. And so this is a way to build a movement of sorts. If you go through that, you become a part of the cohort. That's a growing planning group for how we can impact life and from an inclusion perspective on campus.
Thank you, Jean. I am going to hand it off to our next speaker, which is Professor Scott Hancock.
Hello, everybody. So I'm professor of history and Africana studies. My specialty is African American history, legal history, U.S. legal history, things of that sort. And so Monique asked me to talk about some of the historical context and white allyship, and there was something else there, and they're all related, and anger, which is interesting. You asked me to talk about anger, Monique, because the church I attend to, they just asked me to record a 5-minute video about any topic I wanted. And I said, I'm going to talk about anger. And that was before I even saw your email. So well-versed in anger these days. But as Jennifer probably knows, it doesn't take much for me to get angry. So the historical context, there's so much there, and I don't want to take too much time. In fact, I'm going to time my answer so I don't go on and on. But a couple of things from a historical perspective that I hope will give you some tools, and it actually relates to a couple of the questions, like from Autumn and Allison. When you hear, and this relates also to kind of what Amy is saying, thinking about red flags or things that you hear Professor Daly, when you hear them talk about outside agitators, okay, that has been a historical way in which politicians, law enforcement officials, and many white Americans have minimized the validity of Black protest by saying it's outside agitators. That's what they said about Martin Luther King. That was communists. It was outside agitators. And so it was a way to deflect many Americans, and particularly white Americans, their attention away from the validity and the deep anger that had historical and present roots in Black America. So we should understand that Black people in this country, as well as other groups, and certainly you could apply this to Native Americans and a host of other groups, but we're talking specifically today, I'm just going to confine this to African Americans. That's the primary topic here. But we should understand that anger in the Black community is justifiable. It's expressed in different ways. There are different levels. I mean, if you go on and assume every Black person's angry in the same way, then that's a problem. And that anger, I would argue, has a healthy component if it is expressed and utilized in a way that can be productive, kind of like what Professor Williams was talking about. So we're not just talking about uncontrolled anger, although often that's what it can come to. So yesterday, so there was a protest in Harrisburg, as some of you may know, on Saturday. Dr. Davenport was there. Almost scared the hell out of me when he was yelling at me from behind me for a while, because I didn't know he was there. But and that protest was crazy, and I'll talk about that in a minute too, because it relates to this question of allyship. And so yesterday there was another one, much more organized, much more peaceful. But one of the things that happened there is the police chief of Harrisburg, who is black, came up to talk to the crowd about halfway through. And as soon as he came up, people were booing and yelling and shouting and really were not that interested in being patient with him. And I suspect that some of the perspective of people who weren't there, or if they're not familiar with the history of our country and our present reality, is going to be, well, that seems unfair. You know, he's trying to apologize. He's trying to take some accountability, which is not the tone that he gave Saturday after the protest when he gave the press conference. And he seems like I think he's actually trying to do the right things. And I don't know all the ins and outs. But the response of that crowd at that time, I think, was understandable. And I would argue appropriate, that it was an expression of pent-up anger, hurt, and damage that has been done to black communities. And so that was the figure, right? And that relates to what happened Saturday in Harrisburg, because Saturday in Harrisburg, it was a much larger group of people. They went on 2 unannounced, unplanned marches in through the streets. And so the first one, they shut down some of the streets. And so then they came back. There were more talks. And then when they went on the second march, the police were ready. They blockaded some of the streets. But what they did, and this, my purpose here is not to bag on the police, but what they did that I would argue is a strategical error, and the police chief seemed to recognize yesterday, is on Front Street on Harrisburg, which is a one-way street. It's 3 or 4 lanes near one of the key intersections. They placed a police SUV and some officers right in the direct path of these protesters. So you have several hundred people who are angry and frustrated and hurt by months, years, and decades of feeling intimidated and harmed by our increasingly militarized police. And you then put those police in their path. What do you think is going to happen? So those police officers were surrounded by the protesters, and it was a frightening situation. I saw one of the police officers' face. He was about 20 feet away. I will never forget the look on his face, because he was clearly trying to maintain control and not respond, but was afraid because he had all of these people literally within inches of his face, screaming and yelling at him, as well as the others. And so everything just kind of went downhill from there. So in this connects, so that coming back to, the anger, the failure to understand the anger and the depth of anger, I think, is what perhaps led to a unwise decision to put those police officers in the direct path of those protesters. That said, that anger, I think, is understandable and justifiable. There were some white allies there who were not helping the situation. Some of the white folks there were some of the loudest, most obscene voices, and most of the people who were right up against the police, as I said, literally in their face within inches, most of them were white. So I'm standing there thinking, you are not helping. And in fact, what you're doing is putting the black folks there, you're putting all of us at more risk, right? Because you as a white person are less likely to bear the consequences. And even if you do bear the consequences in the immediate moment of getting arrested, you're probably better able to recover from those consequences. So I think the role of white allyship is be there, be vocal, do all the things that Professor Williams talked about if you can't physically be there. But if you're going to be there, don't be the ones who are setting the police off. If the black folks who are there want to do that, it's, let their voices be the one to do that. But I would argue, chant, be loud, but don't be the ones who are inciting violence, because that's what happened Saturday. Let's see. A couple of just took a few notes here. Some of well, I don't want to go on too long, so I've been talking for 7 minutes. It's probably long enough. And he said 5 to 10 minutes. Answered a couple of questions quickly. What you can do. So I'm a historian, right? So of course I'm going to say this, but the history matters. And educating people that history matters. I have found when talking, it's one of the questions, what do you do with people who are who don't really seem open to this. I have found when I talk to white folks who are much more conservative in their outlook about these things, who want to not see color, not see race, when I tell them some stories, right, stories like Just Mercy, Brian Stevens' Just Mercy, get them to listen to a podcast, like the podcast In the Dark Season 3 about Curtis Flowers in Alabama. If you tell them specific things, like the fact that when I spoke at a white church up in New Hampshire just before the shutdown, and it's a conservative white church. One of the things that really struck a lot of these people who are not normally open to listening to this stuff is when I told them that after World War II, when GIs came back and applied for loans to get homes, 98% of white GIs got loans, 2% of black GIs got loans. That's something they could relate to because they understand how their homes and their mortgages get passed down to their children. And so that opened up it's not a huge window, but it started to open up a window to talk about systemic racism, the generational effects of that, and how these other things can relate. So what you are experiencing as students here in college, where you get to hear people like Professor Williams and Professor Dale, and you get to learn history, this stuff has real world impact. Use it to talk to people on whatever level they're at. So thanks.
You do not get off the hook. You still have not talked about allyship. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes to do that.
Yeah, I did. I said, this is how you be an ally, right? Don't incite the police. What else did you?
Oh, if that's it, then that's fine. Just because I knew that there were a number of requests for allies. And I think oftentimes when you're reading articles and books, they say ally is not something that you can call yourself or a title that you can don. So is allyship something that's passed on to you, or there's active works that go involved with being an ally, or do I call myself an ally because I think Black people are great?
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean. Well, one, yeah, Black people are great, so that's a given. But I see what you mean, Monique. Yeah, so to be an ally, and allies are absolutely critical, right? It's got to be a multiracial national movement. So, but if you want to be an ally, so I'll give you an example from my own personal experience. I would say 10 to 15 years ago, I was my level of understanding about the issues that transgender people face and many queer people was I wasn't completely absent, but it wasn't what it should have been. So I have tried to educate myself. I have tried to listen and read more so that I understand, so that when it comes up in classes or other environments, I can negotiate those conversations in a way that I hope is more beneficial. So you got to do the same, right? So if you're not Black and this is about Black Lives Matter or whatever group that you're allying with, yeah, there's absolutely work you've got to do before you are going to present yourself as an ally. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you. Next up, we're going to have Dr. Daisy Chabet from our counseling services office to share with us about mental health and how all of this comes to a head and how we need for students, faculty, and staff alike to take care of themselves.
All right. Thank you, Monique. As Monique said, my name is Daisy Chabet. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and I'm one of the psychologists on staff in counseling services. And I really wanted to touch a little bit today on our mental health. How are we taking care of ourselves through all of these, concerns that we're experiencing, so that we continue to be strong and see the fight through? So even before everything that, recently happened with Ahmaud and Breonna and George Floyd and their deaths, we're already seeing a huge mental health impact on on everyone as a result of COVID. So a lot of people were already expressing experiencing acute stress. There was a lot of anxiety and depression, increased suicidal thoughts, and just really disruptions in our ability to function. So if you look at that and then you place it in context with everything going on in our country right now, the effects on our mental health has really been compounded. So we really need to be aware of ourselves and how we need to take care of ourselves, because a lot of these things really don't have, like an end date. We don't know when COVID is going to be, handled. There's no foreseeable future for when all of these things are going to end. So if you look at it more like a marathon race, I don't know whether you guys know, but I'm from Kenya, the land of all marathon runners. So thinking of this as a long distance run instead of just like 100-meter race where we know things are going to end, at a particular point. So a couple of things that kind of stood out to me that might be helpful for you. And the biggest that I came across was mostly with relation to how we consume information. I'm sure you've heard a lot about limiting the amount of information that you are exposing yourself to with relation to social media, with relation to the news as well. But I really want to specifically point out how you're consuming that information. So think back to the last time you're watching the news, for example, and think how it affected your body. Did you notice your heart rate go up? Did your chest start to feel tight? Were your thoughts racing in your head? Professor Hancock was just talking about feeling angry. Were you feeling angry and frustrated? And unfortunately, these days, a lot of the news and information out there is it's sensationalized. It's meant to put eyeballs on the screen and retain that viewership. So we really need to be aware of how it's impacting us, because unfortunately with our bodies, a lot of times our brains don't know the difference between I am safe right here in my house versus that's something that's happening, on the screen. Your brain will try to protect you as if you're really in danger. So it goes into the fight flight response. We start to panic. We feel very overwhelmed. We feel very anxious. So we really need to be aware of how we're consuming information and how frequently we do it. So something to consider, instead of watching the news or listening to it sometimes, can you read it? Because this way, since you're reading the information, you just have your voice instead of having all of that, sensationalized, really loud, bold, breaking news, stuff in front of you that is really detrimental to your body and to your stress levels. So that's one thing on, consumption of information. And I'm not saying, by the way, don't read the news, because we need to be informed. We need to continue to be aware of what's happening out there, but we really need to control how it's affecting us. So really be aware of how you're consuming the information. The other thing too is to be aware of the fact that our outlook on life is really dictated by our state of mind. So a lot of times when you're really distressed or overwhelmed or feeling very frustrated and anxious, that's going to be your outlook on life. So we tend to have this tunnel vision and everything seems really dark and gloomy and, everyone's against us type of thing. So we really need to challenge ourselves sometimes to expand a little bit, look outside of that. So instead of thinking, no one is part of, is supporting us, there's a lot of, positive, well, definitely not enough, but a lot of positive changes that have been happening over time and hopefully will continue to happen. So, recently I've been seeing a lot of, on social media, a lot of social media influencers who are really, putting people to task, and putting a lot of the businesses that typically profit a lot from people of color, and telling them, listen, if I'm going to work with you, you need to show support for us as well. You just can't profit from our bodies without standing up for us as well. A lot more people are being vocal and standing up, for the injustices that have continued to happen. So try to expand, outside of just this kind of narrowed tunnel vision that sometimes comes with being, in the state of mind that you're in. Definitely expanding outside of that is helpful as well. Because we've been stuck indoors for so long, unfortunately, our bodies start to feel very heavy. For me, I'll tell you, I've really been trying to practice social distancing and, physical distancing. So socially, I've been feeling very disconnected from people. I miss seeing students on campus. I've missed, interacting with my colleagues. But one thing that we really need to do is really challenge ourselves to continue to stay socially connected. So one thing to be aware of as well is a lot of times, especially with the students of color that I tend to interact with, they've gotten really good at acting as if everything is okay. They're so used to just handling so many things, and unless you truly sit down with them and say, okay, how are you truly doing? How's everything going? They'll tell you that everything is okay, and you'll assume everything is okay because they're used to showing, they're used to giving that facade to people. So check in on each other. Don't assume that someone is doing okay. Just because they're not acting as if they're struggling. So continue to check in on each other. Get out, exercise, make sure that you are prioritizing, your self-care as well. Make sure you're eating and sleeping to the best, of your ability. A couple of other things that I wanted to point out as well. It really helps to have an accountability partner. So this way, if you start to slip or if you're really struggling with something and you have no way of kind of processing it by yourself, you can have this trusted person. And it doesn't have to be a counselor. It doesn't have to be, your family member. It could be a really close friend, or your mom, or your pastor at church. Reach out to someone so you can continue to have some of this dialogue with them and not just struggle with it by yourself. And lastly, I know it can seem really hopeless and dire sometimes, but as a human race, we really are resilient. We've been through so many different struggles in life, and that's one thing I really want to point out to people is there is hope, but there still is a lot of work to be done, but we can do it if we come together and continue to have some of these dialogues together. So thank you.
Thank you, Daisy. Before I open it up for our open question period, and thank you, Professor Williams and others for continuing the conversation in the chat, I have Brenda from the Center for Public Service, who works very closely with our students and student leaders around immigrant populations. And I want to direct to Brenda this question coming from a student, I believe. They stated, recently I have been noticing from personal experience that there's a clash in my family understanding the purpose and reasonings behind the protests happening all around. And this student is from an immigrant Latinx community. In addition, most of my family have not gotten a higher education, which I am privileged to have. I'm a very critical and go in depth conversations. How can I create a dialogue with them on a level where they will listen, understand, and not just have what the news is showing? Brenda?
I'm not sure if you can hear me. I think I'm having some connectivity issues.
We hear you now.
Just as the question in that conversation, I've been having a lot of these conversations with community members that are coming onto the farm, and also family members. So I think the first thing that I would suggest is listen to understand what they are understanding of these conversations. Again, I think like what Daisy had mentioned is that we're watching a lot of news, and kind of making our opinion based on that. So understanding what the conversations that they're having, what information they are getting, and then also trying to process that information with them. History plays a big role, and just as there are many struggles within our immigrant community, we can try to empathize and really connect those journeys together to try to form some understanding. And so my biggest suggestion is to really listen and have these conversations with your family members, and not allow that frustration to kind of push them aside, because we're trying to create some more understanding and empathy within our communities.
Thank you. So we are going to move to the questions for all of the panel members. And from Perry, we have a question. What advice do you have for students stuck in toxic/unsafe households?
That's, yeah. I think I'm not muted. Okay, so that's a difficult situation, to address sometimes, because as students, sometimes you don't really have the personal agency to be able to, say, okay, I'm going to leave my family. I can't, deal with all the toxicity. You might not be able to financially, provide for yourself. So if there's ways for you to compartmentalize your experiences, are there times in the day when you can leave the house, go, unfortunately now we're kind of stuck in the house for so long, but are there, times when you can leave and go take an hour walk, a 2-hour walk, to just kind of get some sort of distance from your family? If you're unable to do that, is there some redeeming quality, even outside of the toxicity, among the members of your family that you can connect to? If there's certain topics that you totally cannot, talk about, can you connect over baking? Can you connect over exercising? And, just reminding yourself too, that is not a situation that you'll be stuck in forever. You're presenting as a student, you're giving yourself all of these great opportunities that would hopefully be able to get you out of that situation in the future. But it's definitely a difficult one, especially in these times. I hope that's helpful for you.
So now that the floor is completely open for all questions, we'll start taking them until our time is up. From Timothy, as we enter Pride Month, how can we keep Pride movements as well as movements such as Black Lives Matters and more in mind? As a member of the LGBTQ plus community, Pride is very important to me, but other movements such as Black Lives Matters and more are also vital. How can I keep them all in mind while participating in them? A panelist?
I can take a stab at that. Timothy, I too am part of the queer community and obviously part of the Black community. So both of those interests are important to me. I did mention before that personally, I will not be out in the street during a pandemic. this is not against anybody who's doing it, but for me, I don't plan to do that. And I think it's not impossible, but difficult to maintain community if you're not out in the streets, shoulder to shoulder with people. But I have been seeing lots of activism happening online, lots of mutual aid happening. Even right here in Carlisle, there's a mutual aid. I think I'll be volunteering on Thursday, where you package foods for people who may be in need. And so there are ways to stay engaged in those various movements. And so those are just some small ways that I am doing so without actually being out in the streets. And that's why at the beginning, I also talked about intersectional solidarity work, right? And so even while I am firmly anchored in Black Lives Matter work, I'm also doing work in queer communities. I'm part of Blacks for Palestine, because that's a very important issue for me as well. There are Palestinians who are standing in solidarity with Black Lives Matter protests and movements here in the United States. And so I think you can find ways, right, to work intersectionally. And I think that is the best kind of work, because lots of these struggles, we recognize that there's a very similar energy that fuels them. And some of the causes are linked as well.
If I could add briefly onto that, and those of you in the LGBTQ community, feel free to check me if I say anything that you think doesn't seem to apply or isn't helpful. But I was just talking to an African-American friend of mine yesterday about this issue, who his perspective is he thinks sometimes, like, Black Lives Matter's emphasis on those issues distract from the larger struggle. And my rejoinder to him was, I think if you read carefully through, like, their website and some of the things, I don't think they do that. But his fear that sometimes you hear from some more conservative Black circles and others, that the issues of the Black community will get hijacked by other interests. And it doesn't need to be that way, right? It's about understanding how these things work together. But one of the examples, like Professor Williams mentioned, was about body cameras. Body cameras isn't something that's just a Black issue, right? It's about power, and it's about holding power accountable. And so anyone who's on the receiving end of that power, who has less power, should be in favor of the police having body cameras and making sure those body cameras are functioning. So I just learned there's an impromptu protest here in Gettysburg, where I live, last week, and just learned the police in Gettysburg, this is what I was told, trying to find out if it's to verify. The police in Gettysburg have body cameras, don't use them. So there are some folks here and that are trying to make sure that changes. And that's an issue that, whether you're in the queer community or the Hispanic community or, whatever community where there is clear convergence on, is very much a Black issue, but it transcends just a particular racial group.
Thank you. We had one student make a comment about an email that was shared. There was a TikTok video of a former student making some racist comments, and Brittany asked, so what steps will be taken, although the student is no longer a part of the Gettysburg College community, in the event that something like that happens again? And Dr. Davenport, could you address the comments?
Scrolling up to see Brittany's question here. I think I scrolled past it. So Brittany, let me see. Okay. All right. Brittany, that is a complex question. And so just to talk about, to kind of go back, here it is. I see it right here. About bias incidents and the incident as far as Gettysburg and what you know, what the college could do. I think, first of all, you know, the college does have, you know, we have standards at the college. We definitely have a mission and a vision and goals, Brittany. And when we talk about things such as is active and implicit against like Black Lives Matter movement, I think we have to take a couple things into context. And one of the things I always look at, Dr. Jamie Williams talks about intent and impact, right? What's the intent and impact of what people are trying to do? Also, we have this concept and discussion, which we talk about at great length and always gets grade, of speech, right? And the impact of speech as it relates to things that are active or implicitly against. I think at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we maintain an environment where there are voices, but we also have to have a full understanding of what the impact is of what's being said in these kinds of incidents, and what the impact is on the community, considering that we do have values, and understanding that we have students that are going to be harmed by what folks do say. You know, so again, being a place of education, we have to make sure that there are opportunities for dialogue and growth as it relates to things that are challenging, the things that will come across with bias. We also have to take into consideration that we have things that might go against policy, right? And things that are a violation of a code of conduct, especially as we talk about students. So we really have to take a fine look at what we mean by actively and implicitly, and what we consider as bias, and things that we can educate through, because there are opportunities to educate through, or things depending on the impact and whether or not they're malicious, other things that we have to address. And that's why we have an Office of Student Rights and Responsibilities that has the ability to be able to review those types of things and see if there are violations of the code of conduct. But at the end of the day, we have to create an environment that's going to be educational. We have to create an environment where people have voices. We have to create an environment where people have discourse, and we have the opportunity to be able to grow together. But we also have to really see what intent and impact mean as far as members of our community and how it looks. So I hope that I don't know if that really fully answers your question, as far as I'm reading here about, you know, action and what can the college do, or what would be done. Again, if someone doesn't attend, you know, there's not too much we can do because they're no longer at the college. But for folks who are here, you know, again, we have to look at the spectrum, right? And that spectrum, I would think, for higher ed starts at a place of education, and we have to kind of grow through that piece. And if I believe folks can be educated through these situations, you know, we all are growing. We are trying to get better. I'm a firm believer, and I'm going to speak just for myself. I'm a firm believer that we are socialized in certain ways. So there's opportunities to grow and develop and educate and socialize people through and out of these things. And I've seen people who have grown, whether it's through immersion, whether it's through connecting with people who are different from them, that help to grow their views. So again, I think when we talk about what the college can do, the college can continue to create an environment where discourse is allowed, where folks can engage, and where perspectives can be, you know, taken. And, you know, again, not going too much down the whole punitive path piece, but I think we have to also look at intent and impact to the community and handle those things equally. So, Brittany, I hope that answers your question, but that's how I look at it as far as when we talk about the active implicit piece of Black Lives Matter. I don't know if any of the other panelists want to add to that.
Thank you, Darian. Amanda, could you do the next question?
So the next question is on the topic of social media. There is a hashtag happening, hashtag Blackout Tuesday. There are many who are participating in it. I personally have been seeing some people taking this as a trend and are posting until now on their social media. How do we go about this?
I'm not sure exactly what is the question, but I do want to say that, so on my own Instagram, I did Blackout Tuesday, which really started in the music industry. And some folks were pairing the hashtag Blackout Tuesday with the hashtag Black Lives Matter. And Black Lives Matter were asking folks not to pair those two hashtags together, because what will happen is that there will be an erasure of news around the Black Lives Matter hashtag. So folks were like, in the BLM community, go ahead and do your Blackout Tuesday for whatever it means to you, but to not pair it with the Black Lives Matter hashtag, because then one is canceling out the other. And so that's all I have to say to that. Again, it speaks to performative activism, but it's hard to read into people's intentions. It's hard to discern what a hashtag may engender, what kind of conversation it may create for people, because it may create an entry point for others. Someone may ask, oh, what someone texted me yesterday, or what is this Blackout Tuesday about? It was an opening for me to speak about it. And so you just never know. I'm just not in the habit of critiquing other people's entry points into protests.
Thank you. We have a question from Joy. Between COVID and the seemingly endless brutality against the Black community, things feel incredibly bleak, especially in this political system where it feels like my voice is unheard and insignificant. Do you feel hopeful during this time? And if so, how?
Could I give that a shot? Joy, good to hear from you. So a couple perspectives on this. As you may know, Ta-Nehisi Coates often gets asked for how he can, what kind of hope he can give people, and he just says, I can't, because he is not optimistic. And there are some days when I share that feeling, and I think many of us do, many of us Black folks and white and whatever. But from a historical perspective, I think there is good reason to think that the organizing theme of much of American history has been white supremacy, or the maintenance of white supremacy, and I would argue that continues, and there's good reason to think that it will continue. But there's also good reason and good examples that point to ways in which those with less power have been able to open up wedges, cracks in the armor, so to speak. And so we've had these moments in American history where there have been opportunities, and we have missed many of those and sometimes only taken partial advantage of those. But it's certainly possible. So I don't look at it like there's no hope. I would love to be able to give you some kind of inspirational, yes, we will change it. I don't know that. I think we can. I don't know that we will, because I think as you look through American history, you see both patterns. And more often than not, unfortunately, I think you see the pattern of those with power manage to find ways to maintain power. But it's never a complete win for those who have power. When I say those who have power and use it to exploit and harm the weak and powerless, find ways to maintain it, but it is rarely a complete win. So that gives me some encouragement that it's worth the fight.
I'd like to answer as well. At once, I feel depressed and hopeful. The depression is twofold. It's one is clinical, because I have severe winter depression, but it's also depression over seeing people be hurt, and there's so much pain. I think this country has not atoned for the structural violence that it has rendered upon Native Americans and other kinds of ethnicities. So I'm depressed about that. But I'm also hopeful, because when you do work across communities, when you do work in community, when you stand shoulder to shoulder with people, you recognize that in many communities across the United States, people are doing amazing work. It's not sexy, it doesn't sell newspapers, so people do not highlight it. But if you are involved in some kind of community work, you recognize people for decades have been working hard and doing amazing work and holding space for each other. And that gives me hope. Just as Scott mentioned, Professor Hancock, read the history. When you see people who have been conscientious objectors, who said, no, I'm not going to fight this unjust war. When you see people who have been hiding other people in their homes from being brutalized in the military, right? There are many wonderful people out there, and that gives me hope. So I'm a Gemini, and so I feel like I have those twin emotions all the time. I feel depressed and hopeful, and that's real. That's probably the human condition, and I carry that with me. But it's not going to hold me back from keeping on educating myself, educating others, and working in community and with community.
Thank you both.
Our next question is the pandemic being severely impacted by protesting. How can we help reduce the exposure of the virus during that protest?
I can take this one. So for sure, there are very valid concerns about people getting together and spreading this virus. But this just shows you how much people are willing to take that risk to be out there and voicing their concerns. I think especially with the use of tear gas and arrests, all of those things we know could potentially amplify the spread of COVID. So the New York City Department of Health has actually put out a list of ways to protect yourself. So wearing a face covering, wearing eye protection, staying hydrated, using hand sanitizer. Don't yell and use signs and noisemakers instead, because the more that you're yelling, you could spread it. Stick to a small group and try to keep distance. But keep in mind, even if you're feeling well, we know that a substantial number of people are infected with this disease who are asymptomatic. So you still have to assume that people could have this disease. So not a whole lot of good news there, but there are some tips there from the New York City Department of Health.
Thank you. We have another question from Maddie. Thank you to the panel. While Professor Hancock mentioned his own personal efforts to educate himself about Black Lives Matters and other movements, as a current student, I am aware that not all Gettysburg professors have done the same. Is there a way that the college, and if not, the student body, can require its faculty to continue to educate themselves? Darian?
Monique, I need you to run that back again for me. I didn't see the question.
Yes. Coming from Maddie, as a current student, I am aware that not all Gettysburg professors have done the same as Professor Hancock, which is educating himself about other movements. Is there a way that the college, and if not the student body, can require its faculty to continue to educate themselves?
But I think require, you're talking about require, that's a hard word to require anybody to do anything. I think there's an opportunity for people to engage one another and in various spaces. So when we think about, the college offers a host of programs, right? From, whether it's HR or the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. But I think a lot of the really great dialogue happens in the classroom. So from an opportunity standpoint, when you're sitting across from that professor or you're having this dialogue, to be able to really kind of provide opportunities for your professors to learn. Education is 360, right? Now I'm not a tenured faculty member. I'm an adjunct from many moons ago at another institution. But one of the things I've always found beneficial was the opportunity to be able to have that dialogue in the classroom, because I appreciated how much I learned from my students in that space. So as we talk about, if someone doesn't have the opportunity or just simply isn't pursuing the education like a Professor Hancock is, I think it's okay in those environments, whether it's in the classroom or in a program in an affinity house, to be able to share resources and offer those up to your faculty or to staff or to administrators to help us learn. while we are in positions of education, I'm speak for myself. I'm not going to speak for the other brilliant people on here, but we don't know it all. We don't know everything about everything. So opening our eyes to those opportunities, sharing things that you are better versed on than we are. We don't have 100 disciplinary areas, right? We have a few. Open our eyes up to things that we may not know. Our society moves quickly. It grows tremendously in an expansive way. Share those things with us. Understand that we don't know it all, and give us the opportunity to be able to learn from you. So if you feel like someone is not maybe as proactive in their education, as far as learning different things about different areas, open their eyes to the things that they don't know. At least share it. Share a book, share an article, have that dialogue in the classroom. You'll help those folks grow as much as they're here helping you grow. I don't know if any of the professors want to add to that. I don't want to speak out of turn, not being a faculty member, but.
One thing I would say, I would agree with Dr. Davenport. So understand that there's an unequal power relationship in the classroom. So if you have a professor, because I've heard stories from students, and I'm sure Professor Williams and others have here too, where professors are not particularly open to being challenged in the classroom when they say things that just are inappropriate, or they expect like the one black student to give the black opinion about an issue, things like that. So I would encourage students, be brave, but also document stuff. So if you have a class session where something like that happens, write down what was said, so that if you feel like at a later point your grade is being unfairly adjusted because you've challenged a professor, then go talk to Dr. Arnold or talk to other professors whom you trust and get the situation addressed. But I would encourage you to document that stuff. So.
Thank you. This is our last question, and it's from Hassan. It's primarily for Professor Daly. How can the healthcare system within the USA become more equitable, eliminating disparities like the ones that allow certain communities to suffer more from issues like COVID?
That's a big question. Yeah. So I have a few quick thoughts on that, and then, hopefully we could take this on in some of my classes. We talk about this a lot. I think number one, fighting for universal health care for sure should be on the top of everybody's list. But I think sometimes we think about health care inequities as living in the healthcare system only. And I think really this is about policies across all sectors of society. So we need to think about housing policy and food policy and prison reform and police reform and all of these things. So I think that's the only way to actually eliminate disparities. And we can think about interventions at multiple different levels. So the individual level, trying to reduce racism, but also at community levels and institutional levels and training and those kinds of things, and the policy level. I think especially in public health and in medicine, we also need to acknowledge when we're getting things wrong. And I think for us in public health, we get it wrong quite often, especially with interventions, where we try to do interventions in a community. We go and we need to educate people about how to eat better and how to do all of these things, when really those are not the underlying root causes of all of these inequities. And so how do we actually think about interventions in all kinds of communities that are more rooted in fighting and recognizing racism, and how do we do that? Because the onus cannot be only in communities of color to try to reduce these disparities, and that tends to be where a lot of public health efforts go, is, well, it's a problem for that community, it's in that community, and so the onus is on that community to try to figure it out. And if the underlying roots of the problem really lie in systemic inequalities, that's a bigger issue and calls for bigger interventions system-wide. So just a few thoughts on that. But I'd actually love to hear other people's thoughts on that. I know that we're running out of time here.
Does anyone have any additional thoughts on Hassan's question?
A previous question that went unanswered, I think it was Allison asked about contacting her Black friends, what she should say. I think that's a really important question because it relates to something Dr. Williams said, that often I think for many of us, it gets to be exhausting responding to white friends. But I don't think that means you should not contact them. If you've got a relationship with them, you don't want to just be silent at times like this. But I think sometimes it's just a matter of just like texting them or emailing or whatever, and just saying, thinking of you. If you need to talk, feel free to get in touch. Then you're not asking anything of them, but you're letting them know that you're aware of them. However, that said, if you don't ever talk to them, don't talk to them just now. So that's why I said, if you've got a relationship with them, then by all means, I would suggest, I don't know, how our other Black folks here would respond, but that would be my suggestion.
I would just like to echo that. I would say if you do have a relationship with folks, check on them. I've been the beneficiary of a number of folks who just text me and just said, "Hey, are you good? I see what's going on in the world. I see what's happening. Are you okay?" So again, to Professor Hancock's point, if you haven't talked to somebody in 3 years and you want to hit them up out the blue, that's probably not the best bet. But if you have a relationship and, we have folks that we care about and folks that we connect with and profess our love for, if you feel like they're struggling during this time, check in. 9 times, and there's been a couple articles shared about that, they're probably not okay right now. Check in on them to see how they're doing, see how they're processing. If their families in the city right now where there are protests or riot, or if someone, it's impacting people in different ways. It's okay to check in and just say, "Hey, are you good? And if you need me, I'm here." You don't have to be, try to articulate anything or try to go off on this spin off about politics in America and policing. If you don't know, you don't know, and that's okay. But if you care enough about them in any other aspect, care enough to just check in on them during these tough times and see if they're good.
Thank you all for that. I know that we could continue this conversation forever, but we can't today. We will be following up after the discussion today with an email for resources, the recording of this, and then a small survey to see if this is a conversation that students and staff want to continue throughout the summer, whether it's weekly or bi-weekly. But we understand that given that the end of the semester ended abruptly and students weren't able to connect with each other, this could potentially be a way to stay connected throughout the course of the summer before we enter the fall and whatever the fall may bring. So just a reminder that will be going out after the discussion today. Programming reminder, talking about and leading into systemic racism, the Eisenhower Institute will be having a discussion at 4 p.m. today on mass incarceration and the impact of COVID-19 as it relates to it. And as you see, the reason that these two connect is because racism is much deeper than on the surface and what your skin is. Systemic racism is a part of what makes Black Lives Matter and what's currently going on in society happening. So I'll also share the information about the Eisenhower Institute's event for mass incarceration and the age of COVID-19, which is at 4 p.m. in the follow-up email as well. I'd like to thank our panelists again, Amy Daly, Hakim Williams, Scott Hancock, and Daisy Chabet, along with Brenda and Darian and Jean, adding their insight. And please continue to love on each other, love on your family, and stay safe. Have a good one, everyone.